will be good for you and for all of us. And there may be other people that are coming in. Please just make room for them as they arrive. So thanks to all of you for joining tonight in person and virtually for our special program, Bicycling, Birding, and hashtag BLM Across America in a Summer of Chaos with Dr. Scott Edwards. For those just arriving, I'm Jane Winchell, the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Dottie Brown Art and Nature Center here at the PAM, and I'm also the Vice President and Programs Coordinator for the Essex County Ornithological Club. And I'd really like to thank the ECOC Charitable Foundation for making tonight's program possible through their donation, and to the Lowell Institute for their support. I am so delighted to be introducing Scott Edwards this evening, and I'm so grateful to him for sharing the very personal and inspiring journey that he undertook 3 summers ago. First, a bit of background about Dr. Edwards. He was born in Honolulu, and he says his interest in ornithology and natural history began as a child growing up in the Bronx in New York City, where he undertook his first job in environmental science at a horticultural institution, Wave Hill. And we have room for you, definitely. There's lots of room down here in the front to come down with seats. Dr. Edwards received his bachelor's from Harvard in 1986. While an undergraduate there, he took a year off from school to learn what it is to be a biologist by spending 6 months volunteering at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, and then assisting with field research on native birds in both Hawaii and Northern California. After finishing his degree at Harvard, yes, he did go back, he enrolled in the PhD program in zoology at the University of California, Berkeley. Then, after 9 years teaching at the University of Washington and curating at the Burke Museum, he returned to Harvard as a professor and curator of ornithology in 2003, and currently chairs the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology, teaches undergraduates and graduate students in ecology and evolutionary biology, and co-developed a program that incorporates museum collections into educational program for undergraduates. He has also edited a book on the early drawings of John James Audubon. Dr. Edwards has served on the councils and as president of several scientific societies, and spent 2 years of national service at the National Science Foundation in DC. He has also served on the advisory boards of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Mass Audubon, and the National Museum of Natural History. His research on the evolution of birds has taken him around the world, and he has devoted his career to increasing the presence of BIPOC in the environmental sciences. He has won numerous awards, both for his research and his efforts to increase diversity in the biological sciences. So we are truly honored to have you here tonight, Scott. Thank you so much for being here, and please join me in giving Scott a warm welcome.
Thanks everyone for coming out. This is a real treat. It's a real dream of mine to give a talk in this amazing auditorium. I'm a big fan of the Peabody Essex Museum. Our kids grew up wandering around the Chinese house. So yeah, it's really great to be here. I thought I would tell you a little bit about what I do briefly before we enter the exciting journey of this bicycle trip. This is my lab group. I run a lab at Harvard, and we're all interested in how birds evolved and how they've managed to move around the world and assume the geographic positions that they do. And so there were lots of diverse talents in, of course, ornithology, but also in computer science and genetics. It's a really exciting mix of people. As Janie mentioned, I'm a curator in the Museum of Comparative Zoology, And it's a really wonderful museum for teaching and for research. And the bird collection used to be, some of you may remember, up on the 5th floor of this august Victorian building. And it was demoted a few years ago. So now it's an underground underneath a new building, fortunately just across the courtyard. We're very fortunate to still have these world-class collections on campus. In many universities, they've been moved off campus because of space and other constraints. A little bit about some of the cool things you can do with natural history collections. An undergraduate named Elaine Vo approached me about wanting to know what the plight of pelagic seabirds like albatross were, and were they being impacted by heavy metals such as mercury? You might think that living in a remote archipelago like Hawaii, they would be immune from all of these environmental assaults. But we went and looked using specimens going back to the 1880s. We were able to measure the amounts of organic mercury in just in a few feathers from specimens. And we were very surprised to find and very concerned to find a very conspicuous increase over time. And this told us that even though they may have the veneer of escaping these environmental assaults, they're still affected by them. A lot of what my lab does is to look at genetic diversity within populations, because that's a really important measure of how adaptable species will be in this era of climate change. And what you can see here is a graph where on the y-axis we have a measure of genetic diversity, and each point here on this axis is a different species. This is the amount of genetic information we have these days. And on the x-axis, these are different conservation statuses developed by the IUCN. So you have data deficient, which means we don't have information, but then you have least concern, nearly threatened, vulnerable, etc. And you can see that these two majestic species, the lace-sanded black-footed albatrosses, have troublingly low amounts of genetic diversity. We think this might be a legacy of the booms and busts that these seabird populations go through when they live on these small islands. You might remember in 2016, this big tsunami came from Japan and basically wiped out the colonies of these birds on some of the remote Hawaiian islands where they live. So this tells us about species adaptability. We also have a lot of interest in just curiosity-driven questions, such as, how did the flightless birds lose their wings? Here you see a remarkable group of species. You're probably familiar with the ostriches and emus and cassowaries. All of these are flightless birds with a very interesting set of birds that are relatives, namely the tinamous. These birds are related to these flightless birds, but they can actually fly. And one of the big projects in my group over the last few years has been to figure out some of the genetic switches that have caused these species to lose the ability to fly. Now, the museum is a really great teaching resource. And at Harvard, we're very fortunate to still be teaching the so-called ologies. And by that, I mean all of those zoological and botanical sciences that sadly have been dropped from the curricula of many universities. So ornithology or herpetology or entomology, these are all very alive and well, and students really enjoy integrating across different disciplines when you focus on a single group. And they especially enjoy getting out into the field. For many of these students, it's their first time to, for example, Costa Rica. And so it's a really great opportunity to train the next generation of biodiversity scientists. Now, the museum has a very august history. Lots of well-known names have contributed to it. This is William Brewster, who donated his remarkable collection of birds and really provided some of the nucleus of the collection today, which amounts to 400,000 specimens. However, there's a lot of voices in ornithology and museum science which perhaps haven't been as well recognized. And one of these voices is Robert Gilbert, who was an African-American assistant of William Brewster. He worked with Brewster for many decades, helping him take photographs in the Massachusetts area and for helping him prepare specimens. If you look at the digital database that we put together for the bird collection with all of our 400,000 specimens, very suspicious that Robert Gilbert's name only appears twice. And that's among the 40,000 birds donated to the museum by William Brewster. So in a small token of recognition, we've renamed one of our rooms in the museum, formerly named after the founding director of the MCZ, Louis Agassiz, a Swiss scientist who, even in his day, was known to be a virulent racist. And we have taken his name off our main meeting room and inserted Gilbert's there. That's, of course, window dressing on all the work that's needed to be done to get more voices heard from the museum community. But like the Peabody Essex here, we're slowly recognizing how to redress some past injustices. So it was the summer of 2020, and we had just been sent home by the administrators at Harvard because of the COVID pandemic. And between teaching ornithology online, I can tell you that it does not work teaching ornithology online. You've got to be outside. But there we were trying to learn about birds. Many of the students did do their final projects in the field in their own neighborhoods all across the country. And once that was over, once we had said very sort of teary goodbye in person those last days of school, I started to think about what I was going to do for the summer. I had been thinking about riding across country, sort of a romantic dream. I had done a little bit of cycling in college, and but it was at that point just a dream. At the same time, I knew I didn't want to sit around the house waiting for some administrator to send another Zoom link for a meeting to come up. And so it's a bit of a, it was a challenging decision, and it's sort of like jumping off a cliff or jumping off a diving board. You're not really sure what it's going to hold for you. On the other hand, well, I mean, I had friends of mine saying, well, where are you going to stay? I mean, where are you going to, how are you going to find a place to pitch your tent or to stay in a hotel? And on the other hand, however, it's not as if I was traveling to the moon or something. This was, I felt comfortable moving and taking care of myself. And this actually is, it's interesting to think about. What is it that allows some folks to feel comfortable on the road, perhaps by themselves, and others not? And that's a big challenge, I think, in terms of bringing new, diverse voices into my discipline, but more generally enjoying the outdoors on their own terms. So here I am in early June. I had my tent and sleeping bag, panniers full of a couple days worth of changing clothes, lots of spare bike parts, a spare tire, pumps, of course. I had my little GPS recorder. And it's really like having a house on your bicycle. It's a really extraordinary feeling of independence. But you're also aware that not everything is rosy out there, least of all the cars and trucks that you're battling to share the road with. But there I am looking clean as a baby on my first week. All of my friends told me, oh, well, you're going to cycle west to east, right? Because that's the way the prevailing winds go. And I asked them, have you done this trip before? Because normally they would be, they would be imagining what they may have read about or heard about from colleagues. In fact, my daughter, Liana, had done an east to west bicycle trip just a few years earlier. And this was with a group raising money for cancer. And so I knew it could be done. But of course, when it came to bite the bullet, it just made no sense to hop on a train, on a plane to fly to the West Coast. The great thing about leaving from Plum Island is, as I'm sure many of you know it well, it's one of my favorite haunts, and extra special, I had my wife and daughter there to send me off, and so that really made it very special. Now, I discovered Twitter on this trip. It was one of the things where Black Birders Week had just begun, and so I was sort of tweeting pictures, and some folks picked it up. I will say, however, as this so often takes place in the press, this sort of depiction is a bit of a myth, because the bottom line is, at least when I started, this was not a trip to change the world in my own small way. It was really just a ploy to get out of the house and to see some of our amazing country from the perspective of a bicycle. That said, it was only a week before I started that George Floyd had been murdered. And there was that horrible incident experienced by Christian Cooper, a black bird watcher in Central Park. And so all of this was swirling around my mind as I started. The truth was, this was a lifelong dream, as you can see there. And, it's one of these big undertakings that you take. I think that being a scientist has helped me sort of take the long view when it comes to complex problems. And so in many ways, this bicycle trip was like a career in science. There's lots of ways in which we can make science more welcoming, you have to have a really thick skin to be a scientist, when your grants get turned down, when your papers get rejected. And so I figure that's kind of like the bumps in the road on a bicycle trip. So here's the journey. As you can see, started on Plum Island and ended up in Sunset Beach, Oregon, 76 days later. This was sort of a northern route, and I was aided for much of the time in the beginning by Google Maps, which more than once sent me on some blind alley to a hill or a road that didn't actually exist. But I also benefited greatly from printed maps of this organization, the Adventure Cycling Association, which is based in Missoula, Montana. And when I actually passed through Missoula several weeks later, I was chiding them because basically all of their maps force you to go to Missoula. You can't avoid it. As much as I wanted to avoid that relatively big city, it was just impossible. So anyway, but those maps were a real lifesaver. Now, I was camping out for about half the time, and you can see from these photos that many of the campgrounds were just empty. It was surreal having these campgrounds to myself. There were some challenging times at the beginning because many campgrounds were only allowing people with big RVs to use them because they didn't have to use the public bathrooms. Me on my humble bicycle was barred from many campgrounds because I would have to use the public bathroom. So it was a unexpected twist. But really some really idyllic spots, much of the time having the whole campground to myself. Here's an elevation profile. And the first set of hills, of course, were in southern New Hampshire and Vermont. This is about the point, even just in the first week of the trip, my good friend Julia Yoshida, who is here, was emailing me about how I have to take care of my ankles and make sure if they're starting to hurt, then you have to take care of them. Of course, yes, they were hurting. Fortunately, they recovered, but it was one of those sensations that you have, and you're just not sure whether this is going to be it early on or whether you'll be able to overcome it. Fortunately, they were able to subside. And then I was in the lowlands skirting Lake Erie. But then I had to see my friends in Ithaca, New York, and so I climbed the Allegheny Plateau in upstate New York. Then again, I descended again towards Lake Erie, which was relatively flat. Through much of the Midwest, as many of you know, there's a gradual increase, but it's so gradual that you can't really sense it on a week-to-week basis. But I will tell you that places like Iowa have a lot more hills than I expected. These little hills can be really, really challenging. And then it was in the Badlands National Park where started to see a bit more terrain, and then increasingly so in the Black Hills, which of course is a little outpost of the Rocky Mountains. I sort of crossed the Rockies, not in Wyoming where my maps were telling me to go, because those passes, so the map said, were a whopping 9,000 feet. And I made an executive decision from a committee of one that I wasn't going to do that. So I went north into Montana and crossed much milder passes of about 6,000 feet. But to my surprise, one of the hardest stretches of the trip was not in the Rockies, but in the Palouse region of southeastern Washington, where you can see the grades are as steep as what you might see in the Rockies, although the altitude might not be so high. But you have that combined with by then the searing heat of early August, temperatures getting above 100 degrees. And so that was really sort of the final blow. You know, Mother Nature's always trying to keep you humble, and this was definitely a case of that. Now, birds, of course, were a big part of how I sustained myself on this trip. You know, I did not take I didn't stop for an hour every morning to go bird watching. I didn't have the time really to do that, but I would hear birds. I would stop occasionally when I saw something exciting. And I learned, for example, that these ospreys, even as I rode up on what seemed like a harmless little bicycle, they would be spooked from their nest 60 feet up. And so I got into the habit of trying to skirt them and not stop near them because clearly it was getting them upset. Through much of the Midwest, I was traveling through these cornfields, enjoying these exotic species like killdeer. This is probably what it's going to look like, ladies and gentlemen, when we have covered the entire terrain with agriculture. There's a few species out there which have managed to eke out a living. Things like killdeers, of course, mourning doves, cowbirds. These are the species that are benefiting from the monoculture of habitat that we've put in place in many parts of the country. Some species, however, were really new to me, and the upland sandpiper was an example of a species that I really didn't know from living in the Northeast. But I got to know it over several weeks through my trip. It's got this remarkable flight, which immediately reminded me of, for example, a spotted sandpiper. You can tell it's in the sandpiper family. And it was really great to see the species, in some cases, very relatively common throughout the Midwest, to learn its call, to learn its behavior, and to get to know it over the course of several weeks. Here's just a picture of my, I guess the range of the sandpiper isn't showing up, but it covers a big swath of middle America. And I spent probably three and a half weeks in its range. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of the birding I did was while I was riding. I didn't have time to stop and listen, but that's the great thing about knowing the calls around you. And I can say that it offered a degree of solace, of comfort, traveling through towns and areas where I didn't know anyone. But hearing the birds, being so familiar, it often gave me a sense of comfort in an otherwise alien place. As I moved further west, it was super exciting to begin to see species that really told me that I was moving. For much of the first 3 weeks, I was sort of in the eastern woodland forest, where many of the birds are the same as what we'd see in Massachusetts. But when I began to see the western kingbirds and the western, yellow-headed blackbirds, it was just, that's what really convinced me that I was making some progress. So these are the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. This is the range which I elected not to travel over. It's quite formidable, and this is actually a shot from a colleague that I was put in touch with by the folks at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Amazing vistas, golden eagles, pronghorns, white-tailed deer, and it was this range that caused me to skirt north up into Montana through the Crow Indian Reservation, and then to turn east again to cross the Rockies closer to Missoula. Spectacular scenes that it's easier to see really from the quiet of a bicycle. The Missouri River was one of my favorite rivers. I spent several days cycling north beside it and then crossed it here in Chamberlain, South Dakota. And of course, swallows, as many of you know, they're another group that's really benefited in a lot of cases from human construction. Lots and lots of these swallows making their nests under these bridges. The potholes in South Dakota was a habitat that I had never experienced before. In fact, it took a text from a colleague when he saw me tracking my way through South Dakota to tell me that I was in the potholes. And of course, it all made sense. These are these very small patches of ponds and fresh water sandwiched in between these fields of corn and soybean, as you can see in the background there. But as you just saw, there's remarkable biodiversity. There's white-faced ibises, black terns, really these islands of biodiversity that fortunately, many of which have been preserved. It would be straightforward to fill these in and cover them with agriculture, but fortunately, many of them are still around. In some of the national parks, it was very much, again, as if I was coming to an island. Outside of the Badlands National Park, I hadn't yet seen any buffalo or pronghorn, for example, or any groundhogs or burrowing owls. As soon as I cross the border of the national park, it's like a biodiversity wonderland, and it really underscores the really important role that our national parks play in just preserving basic biodiversity. Here's some examples of other birds that I came in contact with. The dickcissel was a species that we rarely see in Massachusetts, but I traveled through much of its range in the northern Midwest, and that's another species which seems to be very resilient to colonizing human and changed habitats. This species, I spent several weeks in its range, but other species, such as the California scrub jay, which lives in a very narrow band of habitat, I crossed through its range in probably a day and a half. And so it was quite an interesting journey from the perspective of bird geography, a field that we call biogeography. Seeing how the birdscape is changing across space was really, really fascinating for me. Now, sadly, many of the species that I encountered were as dead birds on the road. And this just underscores the real, often unrecognized toll of our highways on bird populations. Just extraordinary diversity. And of course, this is compounded by the large number of individuals every fall that fly into our glass windows, and we can all do our part by letting our local town and city ordinances know that they can build buildings that are bird safe from the point of view of migration. But very, very sobering. I think it's something on the order of 200 million individual birds that are killed each year on our highways. And so this is something that we need to be more cognizant of. So the rivers that I crossed during my journey were really kind of the bookmarks, and they really were some of the great ways in which you can see progress on my journey. These are some of the rivers in the east that were particularly resonant. For example, the Illinois River, I don't think I had ever seen, and it really had a nice vibe to it. I have to say that my favorite turned out, well, not my second favorite, turned out to be the Missouri River, partly because of its beauty, but partly because of just all the really amazing history. We'll talk a little bit about Lewis and Clark in just a bit. In the West, we have another great set of rivers, many of which are laced in really interesting stories about how our country had developed. Little Bighorn River, of course, is named after a Native American tribe, but also the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was one of the few encounters in 19th century America where Native American groups won in battle over the American colonists. The Yellowstone River was perhaps my favorite river. I spent over a week along its shores. And of course, this was a major guide for Lewis and Clark in their journey west in 1804. Clearwater River, one of the best, apparently one of the best salmon rivers in the country. And then the sort of the surreal, almost lunar landscape of the Columbia River, just a huge volume of water going through that. This is one of my favorite campsites along the Yellowstone River. You can see the I-90, Interstate 90 is in the background there. My wife Beth and I, Beth is here tonight, we actually returned to this very spot about 2 years later, or just last summer. And it's remarkable some of the little details that are changing. There was a wind turbine up on the horizon that wasn't there. There were signs on roads, which I wish had been there when I was traveling, which are now there. And so it's just really interesting to see how subtle changes are constantly taking place across our landscape. Native American presence, as you can imagine, was ubiquitous, and I think it was really nice to just absorb some of that through all of the places I traveled. I learned, for example, that the Meskwaki tribe is the only federally recognized tribe in the state of Iowa. And amazing, inspiring stories from many different places. I will say, however, that I did run into folks who had the knee-jerk reaction that Native Americans might be dangerous, or that they might that I should avoid their reservations. And one of my most memorable evenings was staying in a small little apartment that was put up in the Crow Indian Reservation in northern Wyoming and southern Montana. And I think this is just one more example of how personally we need to make connections with folks that are different from us, who've had different histories. That will go a long way, I think, towards dispelling a lot of the myths that we can build up ourselves. On my way over, I stayed with a colleague of mine, Sangeet Lamachaney, who's now a professor at Kent State University. And I just was so inspired by his example. Like all of us, Sangeet is an immigrant. He's raised in Nepal. You can see that the sign on his outside on the town edge is just reeking of progress and optimism. You can see that his neighborhood, he just bought a house. It's so new, no one even has lawns. There's no trees or lawns, but this is the American dream. This is what Sangeet has won through his hard work and creativity. It was very inspiring to think about his story and how far he had traveled to become a successful scientist. Many of the small towns I passed through were really inspiring. And there was, if you're ever traveling through Winona, Illinois, just hang out by the town green there for a while, because a really friendly lady will come out and give you a brochure and give you a coupon for a free ice cream at the ice cream store. This couple put together this, lovingly restored this Lincoln era schoolhouse, which kids from Chicago come to see. And it's a really great example of community spirit and what collaboration can do. However, there were lots and lots of examples of decay through a lot of the communities I passed through. Lots of decaying infrastructure, stores that were closed. This food mart was closed. Many of these very small towns, almost like walking through a ghost town. And this, you have a sense that the economy is changing quickly. What makes people wealthy is changing quickly, and it's challenging sometimes for folks in smaller towns to keep pace. And so it's a challenge for everyone to be brought along on these waves of technological innovation. Speaking of barn owls, Iowa is the most managed state in the country. It's about 95% of its land has been modified. And yet there were these really remarkable islands of serenity and biodiversity. And so you can see here efforts to restore barn owls to areas in Iowa. There were, and in fact, the only barn owl I heard during the trip was on a little campground next to the Otter River, where there were barn owls calling at night. Again, thinking about the Native American presence, these are really remarkable murals, lots of examples of Native American art. This is Sacagawea, of course, and she's telling the myth of her ancestry through this picture. And it's very inspiring to see communities taking stock of their heritage and their identity. Many of the areas I traveled through were surreal insofar as you have these this carpet of agriculture, but you also have these beacons of the future, alternative energy. And this was really inspiring to cycle through. And yet, again, many examples of very aging infrastructure and clear evidence of economies on the decline. Here's one of the many very mile-long coal trains which I saw throughout Wyoming. And I would always ask people, where are they taking this coal? And people would sort of jokingly say, oh, they're taking it to China. It turns out that we don't actually export that much coal to China. And so it's the scale on which things are moving is simply staggering. Again, just examples of this incredible agricultural infrastructure and the many ways in which we're able to move huge amounts of food and grain across the country. In this video on the left, I can show you a long-standing mystery was solved for me. I was fascinated by these cylindrical bales of hay I was seeing all over the place. I'm a city boy when it comes right down to it. I finally was able to see this hay baler in action, plunking down these cylindrical bales of hay. And I actually spent 15 minutes, well, first filming this guy, and then he came over. I thought he was going to slug me since I was just sitting there staring at him. But we had a really interesting talk about his livelihood, managing some of the farms in his area. Lewis and Clark was a real constant presence throughout the second half of the journey. And in fact, Interstate 90 largely follows their path. And you can see again these depictions of Sacagawea here, without whom I think historians agree the journey would have been a disaster. She was the mediator between the Lewis and Clark group and many of the Native American groups that they encountered. And if it weren't for her, much worse fates would have greeted them, we suspect. This remarkable state park, Missouri Headwaters State Park, it really should be a national park. This, in fact, is where the Missouri River begins. This was the goal, in many ways, of the Lewis and Clark expedition sent forth by Thomas Jefferson. And it turns out that the Missouri River is, it's not some little trickle coming from a small stream in the Rocky Mountains. It's a confluence of three rivers, the Jefferson, the Gallatin, and the, what's the third one? It'll come to me. But it's a very, very serene spot. I often thought of York, who was the African-American slave that went with the Lewis and Clark expedition, one of the first African-Americans to travel in the Western US. And I thought about what he would have been thinking over 200 years earlier as he moved through this incredibly different land. And lots of sort of poignant images about reflecting some of the values that we have in our country. I often think what it would have been like had I cycled across a country in Europe, such as Sweden or England, where it's perfectly legal to camp on so-called private lands, provided that you're not right in front of someone's front door. Sad to say, I simply didn't feel comfortable camping on the side of the road. I've done that in other countries, but I think that's sort of a bit of a sepia-toned dream that we might have about what the US used to be like, perhaps in the 50s, and of course for certain sectors of people. I had the one evening I did try to sort of wing it. I didn't have a hotel to stay in. I didn't have a campground. There weren't any, even in through this particular area of Illinois. It turned out to be a challenging day. I won't go through all the details, but I had, as you will see, I had some political signs on my bicycle, and I rode up to the front porch of a couple. They were sitting on their front porch enjoying the beautiful day. They had a big, beautiful lawn right in front of their house, and I asked, would it be okay if I set up a tent in your yard? And they pointed to my sign and said, not with that sign on your bicycle. And so that was a pretty sharp rebuke. Trust me, I realized this might happen only too late as I was approaching them, but it just underscores, you know, it's just not the romantic journey that we might hope it would be. So yeah, as just to end, I started just a week after this horrible murder of George Floyd, and it was actually on the very first day of the trip, cycling through Nashua, New Hampshire, where I saw a lady standing in the middle of a crowded intersection with a sign over her head saying, "We've been silent too long." And of course, she was referring to we've been silent and complacent about all of the injustices going on in communities of color and other groups. And very poignant gestures such as these handmade signs in rural Vermont quickly told me that I had to do something. I couldn't treat this trip simply as a joyride to get away from the office. And so I contacted a very savvy lady in Schenectady who within 24 hours was able to order up for me a series of signs that I put all over my bike. This sign here, STEM, of course, refers to science, technology, engineering, and math. And it was an effort soon after George Floyd's murder to acknowledge the long way that science as a community still has to go before we can really benefit from the talents of everyone to to making STEM fields accessible to everyone. And so this was sort of a day of reflection. We were going to shut down, stop worrying about our minute scientific problems, and think about the bigger picture of how we can make science more vibrant. I also picked up a few signs from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I asked the director then, John Fitzpatrick, give me some signs with some edge, something that speaks to the moment. To be honest, I was a little disappointed with these. They were kind of like lackluster, but this one kind of grew on me. I sort of strategically put this one on the back of my bike so I wouldn't offend anyone who could approaching me from behind. This one I kind of kept in my panniers, but I did take it out I happened to be crossing the Mississippi River on July 4th. How patriotic is that? And so I thought this was a nice, captured some of the challenges of democracy and the fact that we need to have all voices participating. It was very strange, as you can imagine, cycling in many cases through communities with very few people with these signs all over my bicycle. Without meaning to do any slight to the movement, I tweeted this little shot. At least the cows were paying attention. But it was, there were several junctures where I simply took the signs down. I had the sense that I was eliciting dangerous reactions and that I certainly wasn't going to change anyone's mind or convince anyone of an alternate viewpoint. As I entered eastern Wyoming or as I entered northern Idaho. And so, but I did get lots of fists in the air, horn honks. Clearly, there's a lot of folks out there who were hip to this sentiment and who were sympathetic. And I think for that reason alone, it was worth having the signs on there. By the time I reached Portland, Oregon, and I'm sure you all recall how it was really there that the outrage of the summer had simply boiled over. And you can see all of these palpable signs of outrage. And, like clockwork, one of the impressions I had very forcefully was simply that I think some of the big divisions in our country are not so much Democrat and Republican. I think there's quite a big division between rural and urban. Cycling into Iowa City, the signage changed abruptly from 20 miles outside of town to the outskirts. And so lots of sentiment out there. And I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that and perhaps some of the benefits of coming to this reckoning in places like the Peabody Essex, in places like the Harvard Museum of Natural History and the Peabody Museum. A lot of communities within academia are taking very seriously how we can address past injustices. And I will say, I want to end on a positive note because I met a lot of people whose backgrounds were very different from mine. Now, to a person, these people on this slide were examples of the generosity and kindness that I received along this bicycle trip. I didn't always agree with them politically. This gentleman here, for example, was trying to convince me that the Black Lives Matter movement was funded by the Democratic Party. It was one of these things where he says it and I was like, is that true? Of course it's not true. But, it's sort of ingrained truth. This lovely couple were the ones that finally took me in on that horrific afternoon in Illinois where I was refused by the couple on the porch. They had, although they lived in a very rural part of Illinois, they had worked in inner city Chicago with Black youth. They got it. They understood just the discrepancies and the reasons for outrage. And it was really lovely and their generosity was just priceless. These two gentlemen, were really wonderful. They lived on either side of Main Street in Wyola, Montana, which is right in the middle of the Crow Indian Reservation. It's a really interesting, even on the tiny scale of 200 people in this town, the natives live on one side and the whites live on the other, but they all get along, and we shared lots of stories. It turns out this gentleman, one of his big trips of his life was traveling to Denver to see the Eagles in concert. I happen to like the Eagles as well. And so, but you have a good sense of what it is that makes people happy. And I think that's where we can find a lot more common ground than what might divide us. This lovely couple lived in suburban Portland. Sadly, their store in downtown Portland had been one of the casualties of all the rioting. Their windows were broken in. And you can get a sense of how, either through the media or through direct action, it's perhaps understandable how some folks might have a soured vision, a soured sense of the Black Lives Matter movement. Many of the individuals, of course, had received their information not through direct contact, but through the media. And that, of course, changes all the rules of the game. It's a real struggle. I didn't engage with everyone to try to convince them of my perspective. I felt I learned a lot hearing everyone's perspective. And most importantly, I think beyond, if you can get beyond the politics, there is a core of goodness and generosity in just about everyone I met. As I turned a corner in Eastern Washington, I saw this incredible sight. This is Mount Hood in Oregon. You can see the scablands of Eastern Washington there. And as I moved farther down, just this vision of lush, cool coniferous forest was incredibly enticing after that hot couple days in the Palouse. Great birds here, seeing things like brown creepers and of course Steller's jays. Fascinating how the birdscape changed, moving from the drier lowlands of the Columbia to the lush forests of the Northwest. And perhaps the best stretch of the entire trip was this 99-mile downhill in northern Idaho. This was just 2.5 days of just pure joy. And a couple of the best pieces of advice I got were to eat well, something which I've tried to continue to do after this trip. A colleague told me, don't focus on the endpoint, and how true that is. You know, it's in science, in any career, if you focus on the endpoint too much, you'll drive yourself crazy. And same with this bicycle trip. If I didn't want to think about how many hundreds or thousands of miles I had to go until I ended, I was mostly thinking about where am I going to stay after the next 50 miles, and that I think was very, very. It was able to sustain me. You might think that a party of one would be a cinch to plan for and feed every day. But you know, it was constantly hustling, finding a place to stay, this and that, trying to find a route to the next stop. Many times I often forgot just to simply enjoy myself, but this was probably the best piece of advice. And I would highly recommend a trip like this. You don't need to be a superhero to do that. I recovered my paunch, my bicycle paunch, but you can do it. You don't have to be a super athlete. And just to end with my reading list, lots of great people have thought about the connections between people and landscapes, and how traveling by bicycle is transformative. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Some questions. Yeah, maybe
Okay.
you can.
How many miles is that? How many miles is that?
I did about an average of about 52. So I was, I didn't have a van carrying my stuff or anything. I had about 60 pounds, 65 pounds of stuff. My I did take a couple days off at the beginning, but I actually had a ticking clock. I had to teach in the fall, so I couldn't take too much time. I think my shortest day was about 11 miles. That's a story in itself. I had to basically dry out after being soaked the night before in my tent. And my longest day was about 72 miles. But yeah, it all depends on that combination of wind and terrain and yeah.
I have a question. Did the cycling association that you had the maps from, did they used to be called Bike Centennial? Because that was out of Missoula, Montana also.
Yep, they are the culprits. Back in '76, they started Bike Centennial, and it was almost like, I could have guessed that I'd end up on their advisory board, right?
Well,
I pull in, I was introduced by a friend to the director, I had my bike, took pictures and everything, and 3 months later, would you be on our advisory board?
Thank you. That was my life dream, was to do the west to east full journey, but I did do the East Coast Bicycle Trail from Virginia, throughout Virginia in 1977. And that was for me an extraordinary achievement because I was still very overweight. And we had a group of about 20 who camped out at different sororities and churches and campgrounds for the month-long trip. Thank you for completing my journey for me, because I couldn't do it now, even with an electric bike.
Well, you'd be surprised, I've heard from folks that have done the Trans-America route that the toughest state, much to my surprise, toughest state for them was Virginia. Appalachians, but I never would have expected it. But so you've accomplished a lot.
Yeah, my name's Keith Eddings. I just want to say, I've been on the Bicentennial Trail. I did it from Virginia to Oregon in 1983. Virginia it's the Appalachians. It's going up. They were more difficult than the Rockies. Not as high, but the roads were just straight up. Yeah. With names like Lover's Leap and that kind of thing. We also, I did the central route, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Illinois, but then it did loop north into Missoula eventually. So yeah, as you said, all roads lead to Missoula when you're on Bicentennial.
Right.
And I did also, like you, I did a series of stories on it and sold it to Bike Report, which was the magazine published by Bicentennial. And finally, the best day of the trip, and this is another point of agreement, was that amazing downhill in northern Idaho. I'll never forget it.
We were probably on the same road.
When did you finish your
Oops, maybe next, yeah.
when did you finish your ride, and was there a great sense of relief when you finished?
There is definitely a sense of relief. As much as romantic as it sounds to be on your bike for 2.5 months, yeah, just to be able to walk, to be able to sit down, have a nice meal in a restaurant, I was loving it. And to not have to get on my bike after that last day, that was priceless. So, yeah.
Where was that?
Well, that was in Sunset Beach, Oregon. Yeah. And my wife, Beth, flew out to join me there. And we spent a blissful 2.5 days just sitting and relaxing and walking on the beach. It was really nice. Yeah.
Word on the street is that you know a lot about birds. I was wondering how often you had to pull out a guidebook to figure out what you were looking at.
Wow, I mean, there's this healthy, maybe not so healthy schism between, so-called professionals and so-called amateurs. I mean, the bottom line is amateurs are often way better at identifying species than we academics. There were lots of things I saw and heard that, I just couldn't figure out. I mean, there was lots of sparrows going through the the plain states in South Dakota, you know, you try to follow them up, and maybe they were grasshopper sparrows, maybe they were Baird sparrows, who knows what they were. I got a great look at a blue grosbeak, which is kind of neat. That was, I think, in Illinois. But, you know, I'm one of these birders that gets excited about blue jays in the water bath in the backyard. And so, you know, for me, the most memorable sight was this beautiful American avocet, just lone bird sitting on the edge of a pothole, sunset, very, just really striking image. So, yeah, lots of birds I missed, I think, but the ones I saw, good, like any bird that you see well in the classes, it's a really priceless event.
Did you try to eBird, and how did you do that while you were moving?
Oh, no, I confess, it's terrible. I did keep a journal, kept a journal, wrote down my birds, and maybe I'll transcribe them to eBird, but, you know, I'm just a Luddite when it comes to phones, and, you know, I've got the information. If you want it, I can give it to you.
I was wondering if you had your cell phone with you and how you charged it, and also how did people receive you during COVID? Because we were also afraid to be in contact with anyone. Did people let you come in their houses and go in any restaurants or anything like that?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I mean, my phone, you know, it's funny, you hear digital's the future. And, you know, my first reaction to that is in terms of bike travel and other kinds of travel, but you know, what do you do when the battery runs out, right? I mean, I had a little extra battery pack to keep it going for another few hours, but I tell you, I'm out of step, because at our last board meeting at Adventure Cycling, digital's the way. I think they might even be getting rid of their paper maps, and so it's, you know, very useful when you need, you know, Google Maps is, or there's other, you know, apps that can help you navigate. But, you know, and of course you're plugging in every night, but it's challenging to think, how are we going to stay digital if we're really off the grid, right? That does happen. There is a place called off the grid still, and I'm curious how digital is going to fare in that. In terms of getting together with people, yeah, no question, very difficult. You know, there was a site called website called warmshowers.com. It's especially for bicyclists needing places to stay, and I'd say, look, I just need a place to pitch the tent. And some places, a few places actually invited me in. Others were more comfortable with having me camp outside. And I was happy either way. I had a very memorable dinner with a couple in their open garage. The garage door was open. And, you know, I think at the time, you can all remember it, we were all freaked out, and we didn't really know what this crazy virus was going to do to us. And so I just felt very, you know, I was very relieved and surprised that some folks were willing to take me in. So, yeah.
Did you use many rail trails?
There were some excellent rail trails, absolutely. A lot of them really local, and, you know, ones I had just never heard of, but it's very exciting, I think, to see all those local initiatives. And of course, many of them are getting knitted together in this sort of vast continental scale network. And that's, I think, imagine the day when we can actually cycle across the country on trails that we don't have to share with cars. I don't think that day has arrived yet. I think the US is actually really behind when it comes to bicycle infrastructure. If you go to Europe, you can make your way, even in big cities, completely free of cars. So, but it was always a huge relief, you can imagine, to find a nice bicycle trail. I spent far too many days, you know, battling big and sometimes very dangerous trucks. And I did, for example, this is something I'll never forgive Adventure Cycling for, because on their maps, they will put you on Interstate 90 for about 15 miles as you're heading into Wall, South Dakota, you realize that there's basically no other option. You know, you're in this part of western of South Dakota, and it's not, unless you want to cycle 100 miles around, you know, that's pretty much the only option. I will say, however, that the shoulders on that road are like 12 feet wide, so it's it was doable.
Hi, thank you, Michelle Larkins. I'm wondering how and what you ate.
Well, I found a couple, trying to remember the brand. I should get an endorsement from these folks because I was tweeting their pack. You know, you have these one bag meals, you just dump in some water and you boil it. I had a little camping stove. Those, some of them, they've really upped their game. Now, they're not cheap, right? You go to a high-end camping store, like, you know, yeah, but they're really, really tasty. And so when I'd run out of those, it was always like, okay, what are we going to bootleg? You know, some spaghetti or who knows what. But as soon as I got to a camping store that had a good supply of these one pot meals, that was I was in heaven. So.
One more question. I think the bird I couldn't remember before was one of those black ibises that nested in Magnolia, Massachusetts. Did you get anywhere close to the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin? Because I have visited there and they are the ones who raise the whooping cranes. Or did you see large flocks of sandhill cranes or any other large birds like that on your trip?
Yes, great question. You know, I didn't. I've been to that International Crane Foundation. It's a very cool place. But no, I didn't. People were constantly emailing, "Oh, come visit us. You know, we're only 50 miles off your route." But I did see a bunch of sandhill cranes. Yeah, I think in eastern Wyoming. Yeah, and yeah, just remarkable. But whoops, one last question. Got to give the host a chance to.
I heard you saying that you were kind of careful in your conversations with people, and I was wondering, how much did you initiate conversations with people around Black Lives Matter, or did you sort of kind of wait for that to come to you? Just that balance of initiating a conversation that was part of what was driving you across the country.
Yeah, I would rarely initiate it. It was a conversation starter, or as you heard, sometimes a conversation stopper. But no, you know, I'll tell you, birds are a great way to connect with people, and often that's how our conversations would start. And you know, it's great when people know where's the local place to see the best birds. I mean, I wouldn't often be able to go there, but it's nice when people have a awareness of where around their area is a good place to see birds. Yeah, and so I think you know, I think one of the things I enjoy doing is listening to folks, and you know, if you can connect with people through conversation about birds or just about their lifestyles, where they're living, that's always it's a real gift. And yeah, it was, you know, I had very little contact with farmers, folks living in rural America. And it's just great when you can hear what makes them tick. Because yeah, they are pretty different worlds, but I think we have a lot in common still. So,
Leela, did you have more on? Okay. Yeah, just making sure no one on our virtual had something, but was there one thing that sticks out to you as having been the most difficult aspect of this journey?
Oh man. I think just difficult. Well, it's usually hearing about how comfortable life is back home, you know? That's always tough. But no, being, doing it, it's not like I had some dream to do it solo. That was not the point. But, I went from deciding to do it to doing it in about 6 weeks. And so that's not a lot of time to call up your best buddy and see if they can join you. So I think, being on my own was certainly a challenge, but in these days of cell phones and whatnot, it was nice. I'd have my cell phone right on my handlebars there, and I'd get these texts. And usually at the moment, I'm like, oh, come on, who's texting me now? Or I'd have even a Zoom meeting as I'm cycling. Everyone else is sitting with their nice little books in the background, and here I am. So I mean, in many ways, I think my cell phone was a source of company, and yeah, of course, there's always good music to play as well. So.
Well, I imagine there'll be people that want to speak with you, not in, an auditorium setting in front of all these people, but I just want to thank you again for such an extraordinary experience that you've shared with us, bringing us along with you. And I feel like I have so much more of an insight of what that must have been like for you as a result of having the evening here. And your amazing pictures, the videos, all of it felt like we were along with you on that journey. So thank you so much. It's a fun little note. I want to mention that the person who hired me when I worked at Harvard, I was his first person that he hired, and he was an advisor for Scott just a couple of years after I was hired there. So we probably overlapped when I was working at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, and Scott was just starting as an undergraduate. So we were having a fun exchange before. So thank you again for such an amazing experience tonight, and for taking the time to join us in the midst of all that you are up to as a professor and advisor, and all the research you're involved in. Thank you all for coming out tonight and being here with us. Loved all the questions and your enthusiasm along the way. We look forward to seeing many of you at our upcoming event on December 1st with Tom Tyning about the Everglades, and for us to remember that that's the largest subtropical wilderness in the United States. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you again, I hope. Good night.